Understand this. Nothing outside a person can defile them by going into them. Okay? But basically he's saying when you eat something, okay, it doesn't go to your heart. It goes into your stomach and he says it leaves the body. You poop it out. Right? He says that that's not what defiles you. That's not what makes you unclean. Rather, it's what comes out from a person that defiles them. Okay? So we need to see this very carefully because Jesus says it's not the company that you keep, or it's not the places that you are. Rather, it's the things that are in your heart that comes out and exposes itself that tells you where your heart truly is. It's the unseen things for God that matters the most. It's the things that are going on in our heart that matters the most. And then he goes on and he gives this long list of things that says, hey, from within come out of a person's heart that evil thought, sexual immorality, theft, murder, adultery, greed, malice, deceit, lewdness, evil, slander, arrogance, and folly. All these things he's talking about, the unseen. We need to address the unseen things. And so here's the question that I want to talk about this morning is, what is the unseen thing that Jesus is trying to address to the Pharisees, besides the fact that they place so much importance on the outward things? What's really going on with the Pharisees? Why are they so obsessed about these little details? Why are they so worried about these traditions? Okay? In order for us to really understand that, we need to do a little brief history lessons. Okay? So we're going to back up a little bit. In the Jewish culture, the temple of God, okay, not just any church, but the temple of God, the temple that King David, King Solomon built, was the most important thing to their faith. Why? Because they believed in the temple of God was the actual presence of God. Okay? This is a model of the temple before it was destroyed, okay? But they believed the Jewish temple actually was the house of God. That's where we get that phrase. The church is the house of God, because for them, it wasn't just a building or a stone building where they would come and worship. They had a tent or a curtain set up, and behind the curtain they believed that Jesus and God actually lived there. Okay? No one was able to go behind the curtain besides the priest, and that's only once a year after they'd gone through these huge purification things. And so for the Jewish culture, the temple meant everything. It was their security, it was their symbol, it was their power. Because why? That was the presence of God. Okay? It meant everything to them. Now, imagine you're growing up, okay, and somebody tells you that this is your symbol of power. Okay? Here is the presence of God, indestructible, immovable, unchangeable. And in the year 586 BCE, so 587 years before Jesus comes, what happens to this temple? The Babylonians, they destroy it. See, many of us, we don't understand this because we're just like, oh, okay, the temple destroyed, and what's the big deal? It was the sense of security, it was the foundation of our faith. The presence of God was destroyed. And not only was it destroyed, for 50 years they were in exile. Brothers and sisters, contextualize this a little bit, okay? Back in 2001, September 11th, what happened to our country? We had one of the worst attacks that happened to our country in New York and DC and different places, with the plane crashing into the Twin Towers. You know what the terrorists really did for us? They didn't really take away anything else. They didn't take away the buildings. They didn't take away fear of terrorism. We already had that. What they took away was our invincibility. Our sense of invincibility. When the Jewish temple was destroyed, the Jewish people, all of a sudden, they're God. The place where God was supposed to be, the invisible place, the invincible place, was destroyed. And they're sent out for 50 years. During those 50 years of exile, the Jewish people, they started to ask questions, especially the leaders. And they would ask one another, they would say, why did this happen to us? Why did God allow this to happen? And the conclusion that they came to was that we must have done something wrong to make God angry. We must have not done something right, because if we did everything right, then why would God do this? Why would this happen? We must have angered God somehow. That was their conclusion. And it's interesting because if you read Isaiah, okay, Isaiah and the Old Testament prophets, okay, Isaiah, Ezra, and Nehemiah, they all kind of pitch in and they say, here's what God wants to tell you is the reason why I allowed for this destruction to happen, okay? Isaiah says this. Isaiah says, the reason why the temple of God was removed was because you forgot that you're supposed to be involved in the world. That the church, the people of God, have been so obsessed about just living their own life that they forgot they're supposed to be involved in the world. And Isaiah uses these lengthy talks about who Jesus is and how Jesus comes from heaven into the world to say that, guys, we're supposed to be a church that not only exists within ourselves, but we're supposed to be involved and permeated into the world. Ezra and Nehemiah, they say something, they don't reject Isaiah at all, but they add on to it and he says, well, yes, we're supposed to be involved in the world, but they say God wants us to be holy, to be set apart. So now we've been talking for this past, for 2,000 years, we were doing this big discourse, and the big thing about Christianity these days is how do we balance between being involved in the world and yet still being holy? Okay, that's our challenge. But for the Pharisees, they actually lean more towards Ezra and Nehemiah. They said, you know what? Ezra, Nehemiah, you're right. The reason why God destroyed us was because we were unholy. We were not set apart. We were sinning by becoming so worldly. The name Pharisee actually means separated ones. That's what it means. So the Pharisees went so far as to call themselves, okay, God, we're going to do it right this time, and because we got destroyed for not being holy and pure and set apart for you, we're going to restart this, and we're going to call ourselves the separated ones, and we're going to do everything in our power to make sure we don't upset you again. You see, that's why everything was so nitpicky for them. Washing hands, healing people on the Sabbath, doing things. Everything was a big deal because why? At the very core, they were afraid that if they don't do it, God will destroy the temple. You know, fear, and I love this picture because it's what? What is it? It's a faucet. Fear is kind of like a faucet. Because if you leave fear unchecked, what does it do to you? What does it do to the disciples? What did it do to the Pharisees? When you leave fear unchecked in the grounds of who Christ is and who God says that He is, what happens? People do very, very strange things. Let me give you an example. Have you been so hurt before in your past? Okay, whether it's in a relationship or with a significant other person or someone that you really love, that you've been so hurt that you're so fearful of ever being hurt again? Or maybe one time you tried something outrageous, something really bold, like you wanted to be a singer or you wanted to be an entertainer, and so one day you auditioned for America's Got Talent or you auditioned for American Idol and you went up there before the judges and you started singing because you're like, I'm going to do this, I'm going to take this chance. And Simon Cowell or Piers Morgan, they said, this is the worst thing I've ever heard in my life. And you get so torn up and so torn, just totally torn apart that you come away and you're like, I will never, ever again risk getting into that place. You see, brothers and sisters, many of us are in that place when it comes to God. I know the room with this size and with people with this kind of experience, there are many of us that go through different life experiences, different things in our lives, where we experience fear and pain and troubles to the very core of who we are. When certain things happen to us and we don't understand, and guess what happens? All of a sudden, when we lose control and that fear gets unchecked, it's that faucet that opens up and the floodgates open, and what happens? We will do anything to make sure that doesn't happen again. The Pharisees had it right. They didn't get it wrong. They had the right intentions. But what they were failing to see, okay, the part that they were failing to see was Jesus saying to them, guys, I understand why you're so afraid. I understand why you desire to be holy. I understand why you try so much. But you're missing the point. Because the point is, Christ levels all of our fears. The truth that we must understand that the Pharisees couldn't get because they were like, we need to control this situation. We need to make sure this never happens by doing things that are under our control. And God says to us, guys, it's not about you. It's about the faithfulness that is in Jesus Christ. It is about the consistency that is in Jesus Christ. If fear overwhelms your life, okay, whatever the situation is, fear of rejection, fear of failure, fear of love, fear of being humiliated, brothers and sisters, that faucet will open up and the floodgates will run.